Hey, this is your host, Primo. Welcome back to Carside Chat. Today, I want to talk about the way we measure horsepower today. It is literally a broken system in every way possible. And the reason is because we've thrown some different types of engines into the mix, and then we've mixed some things together. And I don't think people understand that the numbers that they're getting aren't actually as accurate as they think they're getting. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday, Jaguar put out their 1,000 horsepower EV motor. Now, you'd think if it's 1,000 horsepower that you could compare that to, say, a Bugatti Veyron, and hey, they should both go 250 miles per hour all day long, anytime you mass the gas, as long as there's either fuel in the tank or battery charge in the battery. The reality is that's not true. That 1,000 horsepower Jaguar motor is probably never going to do 250 miles per hour. At most, it might be able to do 160 miles per hour. And there's a couple of different things that have to be exact for it to make even that 1,000 horsepower power output. The biggest problem we have with gas motors is twofold. The first is that weight is a kind of a problem, but it's a manageable one. While when it comes to making torque is made over time. As the engine spins up, you get to a certain maximum RPMs to make the utmost power from that motor. On the EV side, it's a lot different. EVs make their power instantly, but they're very much affected by weight. They're very much affected by how much power is in their battery, and they can even be affected by the temperature of the battery or the ambient air that's around them. So the reality is, even though a car may say it has a 1,000 horsepower electric motor, you're not actually going to get 1,000 horsepower 80 to 90% of the time. The other problem I have with this is there's a mixing motor problem here. So for instance, it's not going to have one electric motor. It's probably going to have 4 electric motors that all make 250 horsepower apiece. And that's how they get the math, is they add everything together. While a gas motor just has one motor, that's the power. Now we get into crazy mixes like hybrids, where we have 3 electric motors, a main gas motor that puts everything together. Now everything is just crazy. So how automakers have been figuring out is simply just to add things together. And as you can see, with all the variables in the balancing act that's going on, those numbers are never going to be accurate. And in fact, we found out that even with the peak hold hours, so if we put everything in the perfect world, you're never going to get the powers that are going to be described. So for instance, if you have a 600 horsepower motor and you add a 250 horsepower EV motor, you're not going to get a 900 horsepower engine. It just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of balancing that goes on, and things aren't always balanced. Think about it as if I put 2 motors together that made 600 horsepower apiece. They're not going to make 1,200 horsepower, even if they're gas. They might actually make less horsepower because of the combination and the way they're balanced that will end up working against each other. There's a lot of moving parts that go into making that power. Now imagine the motors that we're putting in aren't even connected effectively to each other, and a computer is trying to figure everything out. Some ways, when it comes to traction control, there's good things. For instance, if we use the electric motors to launch, they can be assist, but they're not putting in all the effort that the motor is. What we also see is with the new cars they're putting out, especially in the supercar department, the new thing is supercar engines, notably, I know you're going to make some exceptions here, but as a whole are usually high revving engines that don't make a lot of torque, and they make a lot of horsepower. So now you're seeing motors that have a much higher RPM range, in the range of 10,000 RPMs, but they're not going to make a lot of torque. Now, how to correct that is easy. Throw in an electric motor, and all that power that the engine doesn't have can be assisted with an electric motor. But if you think about that for a second, the math is going to be a lot worse when it comes to that car. Yes, it's going to feel like a lot of takeoff, but is the electric motor doing anything over a certain level? No. A good example was there's a couple of supercars that just came out that claim that they make over 1,000 horsepower, but they have 600 horsepower motors in them. So when you do the math to it and say, well, it's adding that it's 1,200 horsepower, so the top speed should be 235. But the reality is the top speeds were around somewhere between 170 and 180 miles per hour, which fits right into the ballpark of a 625 horsepower heavy laden vehicle. So the real trick here is to have a quick motor that's electric, that pulls the car up to its speed, gets into its operating area, and the EV motors just basically sit back and take a relaxation because they're not good at top speed. The other thing, and I have to say it because it's the elephant in the room, is a lot of reasons why this is happening is not because it's optimal. Yes, there are ways to do EV motors in hybrid cars that is incredibly optimal. I love it when it's designed that way. They work wonderful. I'll take you back to the Acura NSX, which was probably one of the funnest cars I ever drove. Obviously, not the fastest car in the world because it has a lot more weight to it, but for a track car, I would love to put it on the track and see what it did standing up against other cars with traction control EV motors. The truth is these companies are making these because they need to meet regulations. Lamborghini that's making 16 miles to the gallon is not going to meet the emissions regulations it needs to be a road legal car, and they need that hybrid setup to continue to be able to sell cars as we move forward. Now, I'm going to have another video on that later because come 2027, things are going to get really messy, and by 2035, we're going to be in a big problem. But right now, we're not talking about that. So there were ways that people tried to fix it. The first one was SAE, and I'll make sure I get that right. They did the J2908 kind of informational thing. So what it was it's something that tried to figure out exactly a way to measure these effectively and say, okay, this motor doesn't actually make this car, if you will, doesn't make this much horsepower. The motors make this much horsepower, but you pull it all together, this is how the math comes out. So far, and that was back in January 2023, about the only company I've seen use it was VW. Some other people may have adopted it, but every time I see somebody put out a new car from Bentley, Jaguar, McLaren, all these other ones, it's always the add it all together math, which of course doesn't work. So the truth is we used to have problems in the past. So you used to call driveline loss. When cars were tested, gas cars were tested, they put their engine on an engine dynamometer, they rolled it up, and then they put a brake on the clutch, and they said, okay, that's what the horsepower is. And the clutch would pretend to be the weight of the car. It was pretty good, but in reality, we found driveline loss, which was around, could be up to 12%. I think the Viper had a 12% driveline loss in some of its testing. I don't know if they fixed that over time, whatever it is. The point is that the horsepower numbers are more to be a reference than they were a rule. And obviously, there's variations that can happen out there. You could have more weight, you could have less weight, you could be a race car. Things are going to change once you actually get it on the track. The problem is I think the new cars that are coming out that are hybrid, it's not just driveline loss, it's total loss. So a car that's making 1,000 horsepower, then you add motors to it. I don't think it's making the most horsepower. It's making a lot of get up and go, but the engine is not making much more than the 600 horsepower because, for instance, if it's a 680 horsepower motor, it's only going to make 680 horsepower. The EV motors are not going to run over a certain amount of acceleration. So once it gets to a certain speed, it's just a 680 horsepower car. So I think the best way to do this is obviously to measure electric motors on a reference of torque. Now, if you said that Jaguar made 1,000 torque, you got me all day because I think that's pretty close to what the actual number would be. Now, is it overstated? Is there a reference number that works best for it? I don't think there is. I don't think the horsepower numbers and torque numbers really call things out. I don't think it actually makes 1,000 torque all the time. I think that's really called dreamland. If everything is optimal and everything is perfect and the weather is great and you hit the pedal at the right time, great, perfect, we nailed it. The reality is even in gas motors, temperature can affect it, and it's going to run better or run worse depending on how things are working. Unlike the EV, which 1,000 is the max number, there's times when you can get a gas motor and say, hey, the air is actually perfect, we're getting a lot of flow, and the car will actually make better time. So the reality is that we have two basic systems in play here. One is based on, say, for instance, kilowatt hours or kilowatt power versus gas power, and they're not balancing out correctly. And I think what we need to do is maybe J2908, as SAE calls it, is the best way to go, or there probably is a lot better way of going. And I think the best way right now is not to make up numbers. If you are an automaker out there and you're just making numbers up off the fly, we're not being honest with consumers, and that can turn around and bite you at some point when somebody says, hey, I tested this stuff, and we've seen it over and over again. EV numbers are never as good as they say they are. They don't have the longevity. There are some examples I think that do a lot better than what we're being told. What happens after a couple of years and things don't work the way they're supposed to? There's going to be questions. Automakers are doing what they're doing right now because they have to continue to sell cars. But if you're going to continue to do that to sell cars, you're going to have to be completely honest with your consumers. You can't lie to them about how these power numbers work. And the best way I think to do that is to literally say it's got two 250 electric motors and a 600 horsepower gas motor. That's just being honest with consumers. Don't say this is the most powerful Jaguar you've ever made, because the reality is yeah, its get up and go is great. Its long-term stuff may not be up to speed. The other thing that I worry about is, for instance, you may look at a Tesla Plaid and say, that car can do all that. That car can go faster. The reality is you can put all those numbers out there and say what you want about the Plaid. And yes, it is a fast car. And yes, I've seen it 0 to 60. But every time I see it tested, it's tested within its own environment. It's a drag car. But we never see it tested in any other way. So we really don't know because of all the variables involved with the EV platform. Was it set in launch mode? Was it set this way? There's a lot of moving parts that go into making that car the fastest it is. And the Tesla has had time to nail that. So the Plaid is a great example. Another example is Lucid. Lucid's motor is incredible. I think that car can go really fast and would probably be something that could take that Jaguar any day of the week. But the reality is, again, those are brands that have done it for quite a while. Since Lucid's been 2012, Tesla 2003, a lot of time to work on that. These new brands are working on engines and combinations that we've just never seen before. What happens when a couple of years from now the numbers that we're seeing fall apart, or we're just told, look, all that stuff didn't work the way it does? It's going to hurt the value of these cars. It's going to hurt the consumer down the road. I think the thing that we should do right now is obviously work on some numbers that actually work to figure out what the actual numbers are, and just be honest with the consumer up front. But again, if the numbers are honest to me and tell me exactly how this engine is and what the results are from it or how it works, and I can make a good consumer decision, that's great. But right now, we don't have that. And let's be honest, even if everything I said was wrong about how the cars are the fastest or this car is the fastest or whatever, it still brings to the reality that you and I both don't know exactly how this works because we don't have the right measurements. So that's something I hope that they work on. I hope that SAE gets something nailed down. I would like for automakers to just stop telling me stuff or putting grand numbers out there that pops off to everybody because, like I said, they're not real numbers. Let's look at the stuff the way it actually is put out. And I think that'll be better for the consumer to completely understand where they come from and be able to buy products better. The other thing I think is going to happen down the road is we're going to continue to see cars get this right. I think they're going to continue to find balancing, weight reduction, which is going to be huge down the road. And I think that hybrid get up and go is going to be huge. Now, whether that's going to take off on the EV market, I'm not really seeing that for supercars. People don't really get into that stuff. They're very hard pressed to get into the hybrid thing, but I'm seeing a lot of adoption in hybrid, especially when we see the gains that you can get for get up and go. I don't think they can be beat for the weight. You can overcome a lot of weight on it, but it's also, when we do that, we end up sacrificing some of that top end power. I don't have a car that can go 230. And I would like to see more people taking less of these cars on drag strips and more on actual road courses to say, okay, this is what the car was like. A lot of times when I see these testings, the first thing somebody says is, well, the battery ran out after the first or second lap, and we're not getting anywhere near the lap times we had before. Probably something we need to know about in the future, especially when it comes to racing or other things, to say, hey, what's an exciting way of doing this? Nobody's talking about that, and I think that's a huge failure on their part. Just some ideas out there for everybody to take in. Do I want people to argue with me? Absolutely. Bring it on to the comments here. The reason that I'm saying what I'm saying is because this is something that is hotly attested, but nobody is really talking about it, and I want to start a discussion on it. I want people to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? and get our Socratic method on in the comment section. And that's why we always do what we do here, is shake things loose, find some answers, and see what makes everybody happy. Don't forget to write it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to buy some apparel from our apparel store. We always love talking to you. We're going to see you the next time on Carside Chat. Excelsior.